friends, and welcome to another edition of Faith Greater Than Fear. You know, since March and the pandemic, we've had the opportunity twice a week to interview people from here in Joplin, from around the U.S., and around the world, literally, and asking them, as people of faith, how are you adjusting? And what are you seeing God teach you? And how can you embrace the challenges of this pandemic in your business and in your ministry? And so about ministry, we're here today with our special guest, Jeff Hines. Jeff, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Love talking about ministry.
Absolutely. And you live that. And so tell our audience about your family. Tell us about the early years of ministry. And then eventually, obviously, we're going to get to what you're doing right now. So tell us about your family, sir.
Well, I have a lovely wife who is the daughter of a veteran missionary to Africa for over 23 years, Charlie Delaney. He had two daughters, Robin and Shanda. I married the younger one. And I might add that she was a senior when I was a freshman at Johnson University, and it took her 4 years to find the man. So she almost gave up, and then finally he arrived. And then and then I was exposed really to missions through that missionary family, great missionary family. And then we had two children together, Delaney, who is 27, who works for the church out in Los Angeles, the church that I pastor called One&ALL. And then Sion, my daughter, works in Kazakhstan. She's doing a phenomenal work there. And it's a good family. And I have been influenced by my father-in-law to a great degree, as I guess you should be. And all of both my kids are involved in ministry, love the Lord. My wife grew up in Zambia on the Copper Belt called Ndola. So it's a good family, very close family. We are indeed very close. And I miss my daughter greatly, but I think sometimes God reminds me, well, this is what you did to your mother when you left her and went to Africa, because I spent 10 years in Africa in my 20s, and then my 30s I spent in New Zealand doing mission work, and in my 40s I've been out in California, which is, as we know, is the greatest mission field of all. And so yeah, that's the early life, and then ministry, and then right now I've been the pastor for 12 years of ONE&ALL Church, and that's been one of the most challenging, probably the most challenging time of my life, being in Los Angeles. I think God called me there. I don't think I would have ever chosen to live there. In fact, when I've been traveling speaking, I know that when they announce that I'm from California, that people automatically look at me and think, well, has he been tested? And I always say I have been tested twice, and I'm totally free of the imbecility virus so far. And so, because it's one big loony bin out there. I mean, I love Californians, but it is a loony bin out there. I think most of the world knows that. In ministry, this COVID-19 time, though, Mike, I think this is a really important time for us to be very honest with some of the struggles that we're going through, and also some of the lessons that we're learning. I got to be honest and tell you that while nobody wants COVID-19, I don't want anybody to die, and I don't want any pain and why would you want that? At the same time, I do realize that God is shaking me up a little as a leader and pastor. And part of that is the rhythm of my life. You know, I don't think, Mike, I've ever gotten this right. And I think our personality types, I'll bet you struggled with it too. Pat, the visionary type person, struggles so desperately to keep the rhythms balanced in our lives. We're always driven to go to win the next soul, to preach the next sermon, to start the next movement. And that's something that God wires in us, but it has to be balanced. And I know I've shared with many people about 5 years ago, I went through about 2.5 years of severe anxiety disorder. Now, for those who don't know what that is, you know, it's not where you're worried about something and one day you wake up and you're just so overwhelmed with worry and depression that you can't control yourself. We actually don't know much about this mental illness, but we do know it is a mental illness. And I was in probably the best place in my life when these attacks started coming. And it might be because my body was saying, hey, you know what? Now you've got some time. You're going to pay for all this stress and all this hard work you've been doing. And so I had my first anxiety attack in Zimbabwe, in Africa, in the place that I love so much. But the point I'm making here is God, I believe, as much as I hated that experience, I can also tell you that I realized in ministry that I really did not know who Jesus was until I went through this. Now, he's my Savior, yes. He's the one who places his Spirit within me to sanctify me, to open my eyes, and to change not only what I do, but what I want to do. Yes, I know those things. But knowing Jesus on a personal level requires you to come to the end of yourself. And you have to experience something like that until you really know how you have this prevailing presence where God comes on the inside and you start to know, man, he is so much more. He is Savior. Yes, I know, but he's the lover of my soul. He has a genuine love for me. And until you have that experience, that prevailing presence, you really don't know what that's like. And so I'm grateful for that time as much as I detested those 2.5 years. Well, here we are in COVID-19, and I've had to look again at the rhythms of my life, and I've noticed some things that I didn't really learn enough lessons during the anxiety disorder, because I've been preaching 5 and 6 times, Mike, on a weekend. My father-in-law told me that there's no way I'd be able to keep that up. But here's what COVID-19 did for me. I realized that, why am I doing that? Sometimes I think we have to ask, whose kingdom are we really building, God's or our own? And I've realized during COVID-19, there's a lot of habits in my life that God never asked me to do, that I do them because I'm afraid of losing something. And what am I afraid of losing? You and I were talking at an earlier stage. I hope that one thing we learned during COVID-19 is that we need to be more passionate and more possessed with disciple making, with people's lives being genuinely transformed, people far from God coming near, rather than enamored with how many, as they say in New Zealand, I think I can say this, how many bums are on the chairs. That's a favorite phrase of mine I learned from my New Zealand days. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, that's kind of crass, but really, they understand the difference. And I think when we go through times like COVID-19, my kids, my wife and I have been talking, what about our rhythms of how much time we spend together? We have the date night, okay, but what happens in the date night? Are you really talking? Are you really engaging? Or is it just one thing you're clicking off the calendar again so you can move on to the next item on life's or the day agenda? And so this has forced me and my wife, and both my kids have told me the same thing. It has forced all of us to go back and have that non-negotiable where we have our time with God, where it becomes, you know what, I'm going to have this time with God because I need God. And, it goes back to the old Chuck Swindoll phrase, you'll never know that Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. And I think it's interesting that what's been attacked during COVID-19, our wealth, our income, our ability, our liberty to travel, our ability to do so many things. It's almost like God said, okay, I'm going to help you focus on me again. I want to take some of these privileges away from you so that you're going to have to sit in your house. And when you sit in your house, what are you going to do with that time? I mean, I would hate to think that most Christians are singing the same song of binging on Netflix. I would hope that we're actually reading the Bible and reading books that we've not been able to read for a long time and having intimate times of prayer with God. And so for me personally in ministry, I've really had to ask myself a lot of hard questions that I thought I had answered 5 or 6 years ago. I think the human propensity is to go right back towards self-aggrandizing and to forget that as Christ followers, we're supposed to die to ourselves and live for Christ and his glory. And so that's some of the lessons that I've learned in ministry. And I can tell you though that I've never really experienced the fear of COVID-19, Mike. It's not because I don't think that I'm some kind of special person under protection. I think we all at any moment could contract the disease and could possibly die. But the one thing the anxiety attacks, before I could get over them, I had to make my peace with death. That the doctor told me that's why they stopped. That you made your peace with death. So the brain was no longer firing worry into the body because you'd already made well, if I die, I'm going and I'm with the Lord. And when that happens, when you really make your peace with death like that, COVID-19, you take it in stride. I have no guarantees that I won't get it. I have no guarantees I won't die from it. But you know what? I'm part of a kingdom that lasts forever. And if I do go and be with Jesus, I can think of a lot worse things. And so that brings a peace about. Do I wear a mask? Yes, when I walk into a building, people say, wear a mask, I'll wear one. But for their good, not primarily for my own. And so I think those are the lessons that we're learning, and I think they're good lessons.
Oh, very good. So a couple of things to unpack and redo there. Number one is I had a friend one time said, Mike, we're called human beings, not human doings. And what you're talking about is being in the presence of God, not always being task orientated. Another thing that we hear right now is during your journey of the anxiety elements that you had, can you imagine, Jeff, how many people are probably in a similar situation right now? And so the statement of dying to self, having peace about where I'm going to go is so critical and so important right now. Tell our audience, Jeff, really not puffing up or anything, but to let them know how many were in your worship services, how many places were you locations as a church multi-site, and then saying what God has done with technology now to give you kind of a vision of what can happen and how God has given technology and given you some insights into the future post-COVID, because there will be a time that we are going to be post-COVID. It may still be like the flu. We're going to have to get a shot with it every year. Even now, I mean, we had 80 to 100,000 people that died last year that we know of from the flu, and nothing stopped. We just have to learn to live with it. So as we learn to live with coronavirus, you've done some pivoting in your leadership. And tell us about that. First, about the size of the congregation and how you've pivoted and what you see in the future.
You know, I have the privilege of serving in a church where the two pastors before me were incredible leaders and great men. So it's not like I walked into something and, you know, so I want to honor the past. Those guys were phenomenal. Chuck Boer was the youth pastor, and a guy named Ron Keller was the senior pastor. And I've interviewed both of those guys. I actually brought Ron Keller back one weekend just to honor him, because I realized that I inherited. I'm the young guy that walked in to inherit so much of the good fruit of a guy who spent his life trying to build something very special. Ron had good rhythms in his life, though. We should have learned from him. He had very good rhythms in his life. So when I came, the church had not had a lead pastor for about a year. Ron had retired, and Chuck had moved on to another place. And so when I came, the church grew very fast because a lot of the people came back, and then it got momentum going. And so then we outgrew our property within the first year or two of my ministry there. So on a given weekend now, we'll have close to 8,000 people, but they're on 4 different campuses. Now, this goes to show, you know, when we first started growing, because of my mission background, Mike, I did not want to go in debt for something. You know, in California, it was going to cost me $50 million to build. And I spent 10 years in Africa. I know how little we have to work with. And even in New Zealand, we had so little to work with. And I thought, I just can't justify that. I know how much good that would do in places. And so I thought, why don't we go out wide? And so I started listening to some leaders who were going more out and creating what we call satellite campuses today. The problem with that is, you know, when I was younger, a lot of our pastors of the churches gave me an opportunity to preach and develop my preaching gift. And I've never been I don't want to denounce anything, but I never felt God calling me to be a satellite guy only, but because I needed to invest in the next generation as well. But then I noticed that the culture in California, the ability to reach people who would not come to church through a online presence just blew my mind when I started watching the numbers. People who would never come to church but were interested in Christ. And then when we started doing these outreach events online, and we actually hired a full-time online campus pastor, you say, well, what would he do? He engages all these communities. And so suddenly you're talking about thousands upon thousands engaging and asking questions that they would never feel the freedom, they said, to ask in church, or they felt uncomfortable coming to church because they didn't know what to expect. You know, we're living with a culture now that is an anti-church in California. They're totally oblivious to what church is. So they don't have they're just afraid to go because they don't know what's going to happen. And so to create an online church for them to be able to hear messages, see worship, and then ask questions, it started growing by leaps and bounds. So that we had to hire another staff member who was called First Steps, so that if you're online and you want to receive Jesus or you want more information, you've got to have a full access to a full-time pastor who will answer any question you have about the Bible, about Christianity, about comparative religions, and he's got to do that very well and lovingly. So we've got a great guy that does that. So I would say, Mike, that over 50% of the people who have come to Christ through ONE&ALL Church in the last 5 years have come through the online presence. And so because we ran out of room at the auditoriums, and I wasn't going to build a $60 million facility, and we did stretch out and do and do satellite campuses. We have 3 of those, but they're led by great pastors, but they will tell you the same thing. So just a quick example. We started a campus in a place called West Covina, which is where the church originally began. So we went back to plant a satellite there, but their number one tool to get people into this new satellite is not the mothership. It's not people coming there, oh, I want a campus. No, it's the online community. They go on and so we have an online campus pastor for the West Covina campus as well. People come ask questions. Oh, you have a campus in West Covina. That's where I live. Can I ask some more questions about Jesus, about Christianity? What's your position on this? And then we've created all of these special little YouTube videos where we can answer any question that you have, even if you don't want to talk to the campus pastor. You click on that video, answer to your question. So I've become a huge fan of understanding that evangelism, we have got to adapt to the growing generation that is doing everything they're doing online. You can say on the one hand, well, there's so much bad, but Jesus has a way of taking things that were meant for evil and turning them for good. And so if we can use media, if even Facebook, YouTube, or even an online channel, if we can use that to capture people who are far from God, and they feel the freedom to at least go there, and they're not as nervous, they're not as uptight, they can at least go here and ask their questions and be loved and appreciated, and ultimately that gets them to attend one of our campuses. Are you kidding me? For me, this is the future. This is the way we're going to reach a generation who may never come through the front doors.
That's awesome. And as you and I were talking beforehand, COVID didn't shut church down. It closed buildings, but it never stopped the church. And you're describing the church adapting and adopting technology and new gifts to her from God and creative individuals that are allowing things like Facebook, like the internet, that I say for the internet to people, it is the thing that enables the church to go everywhere to anyone. And so why should we be surprised if for years the dating game has moved online, where somebody meets somebody and they feel to do it online is safe, right? So here we have people who don't know anything about the church, don't know anything about Jesus, like you said. They feel less of a boundary there. They feel more welcome. They're safer. They can put their foot in, ask the questions, watch the YouTube video, like you said, and then go ahead and process it and then come back if they want more. Brilliant. So give us, when you're talking about the number of campuses and what you inherited, and I appreciate that heart, give our audience in this closing minute here two things. One, of just about how many people you think that the body of believers is reaching out in California now during COVID, and the small groups that you're having, watch parties you call them. And then, and we do that all the time in football games, right? So now why shouldn't we be surprised that God could use watch parties for his purposes? And then give us a closing comment of how you want to encourage us as you see what God is doing through COVID as body of believers for the future. So.
Well, I appreciate you saying that the church never closed. It never did. In fact, our church has been more open during COVID-19 than it ever has. In fact, the mayor of the city of San Dimas contacted me and said, look, I got to tell you something. We are so grateful for what you've done. And he wasn't, you know what he was talking about? During COVID-19, because we got less busy, our care center, we have 4 campuses, and we built a care center in the middle in a place called Pomona, which is one of the poorest counties in LA. And the care center gives food and clothing and counseling, addiction counseling, marriage counseling. It also is temporary housing. Well, all of our people who usually don't have time to volunteer, guess what they were doing? They were going to the care center and volunteering. So they were loving on the community. So the church was more open then. I was so proud of our people. They said, well, I'm bored. Give me something to do. I said, go to the care center. But a lot of them went there on their own. So that's the first thing. The church has never been more open. In fact, I want to give you a quick scenario. I'll try to do this in 30 seconds. People sometimes ask, even in California, they would ask me, why aren't we opening? And it became a real political issue for a while. And so people said, you're not doing the right thing because we're not open. I said, well, wait a minute. We're not being discriminated against because there's no sporting events, there's no school, there's no nothing. If everything was open but the church couldn't open, that would be a different story. But let me give you a different perspective. Because our people were getting into community, I've been pulling my teeth for 10 years trying to get people in community. When COVID-19 hit, they all went and got in community of 30 or less people in watch parties. They would meet together, watch the services, then pray together, then they would have a meal together. Heaven forbid that we should become Acts 2. And so I saw this happening, and then I saw people inviting their friends, because during COVID-19, people were scared. And they still are. They're saying, I need something more than I have. I realize that I don't have anything to sustain me. So then suddenly my Christian friend invites me to a home. Now, I may not go to the church, but I'll go to this home over here because we're just going to have a meal. And then next thing you know, they're watching a sermon that they haven't watched for 20 years. So that was a good thing that's happening, and we're going to continue that after COVID is over. And I think that it will be. I think that I don't want to go back to the old norm, Mike. I don't want to go back to where you're not in a community and you're just using church an hour and a half on Sunday to get a spiritual buzz. And I'm not saying everyone's like that, but how can we continue this discipleship and community and watch parties and still meet together? My team right now, we're trying to sort that out. I don't have the answer yet. I just told them I don't want to go back to the old days. Surely we've learned something in the midst of this that we can carry with us. Maybe God caused us to pause to have a good look at what we're doing. And the other reason I didn't open quickly is because I am not only interested in loving God, I want to love my neighbor. And I knew that all of our neighbors were watching all of our campuses to see if we really loved ourselves or if we loved them too. And I'm trying to do something that would communicate to them, we care about you too. Even if you don't agree with us, we care about you, because we could have very easily become the epicenter of the COVID virus had I opened in March or April like they were asking me to do. Then you got all these people gathering, and then they take the virus back out. So our community, the respect that we've gained from our community in these days and the discipleship that we've experienced internally, I don't know how else that could have happened. So it's been an amazing thing where God took that disadvantage, worked it for an advantage to use it for his glory.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate your passion, your wisdom. So friends here, dating online is possible with Jesus, and it doesn't have to be threatening. All of a sudden, we can go back very biblically to fellowship and having a meal, and then finally to get empowered to get in and help those who are broken and give them a hand up and love on them and really be engaged at a grassroots level. Those three things. And I would say there's another one I venture to say, and that is it's given you and your staff more of a balance you talked about earlier, because you don't have to do 5 and 6 events all of a sudden. You can prepare better, and you can do it once and then let the technology be your replicator over and over and over. And so it gives you scope, but it also gives you balance, and hopefully it lengthens and deepens the meat that you have. So Jeff Vines, thank you very much for taking some of your valuable time to come share with us today. For all of you, thank you. Hope you've enjoyed our conversation with Jeff. And if you have, on your social media channels, share it. And it's a podcast version available as well. And we just know that we want to say God blessings to you. Thank you for what you do as a person of faith. Stay strong and make sure that your faith is always exhibiting that it's stronger than any fear. God bless you.